My sister-in-law bragged about taking my house, my deed, revenge, exposed lies, and reclaimed home. My sister-in-law had no idea I owned the house she bragged about. "You're just living off my brother's money," she yelled. I smirked. "Is that so?" She called my in-laws to evict me, but when I showed the deed, she packed her bags in silence. My name is Tessa, and I should have known something was wrong the moment Nadia walked into my house with a measuring tape in her purse. She didn't ask to borrow it. She didn't explain why she needed it. She just pulled it out during what I thought was a casual visit and started measuring my windows while I was making coffee in the kitchen. 42 inches, she called out from the living room. Perfect for the curtains I saw at that boutique downtown. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me and sharing these stories about standing up for ourselves. If you believe women deserve respect in their own homes, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now, let's see how this unfolds. I walked back in holding 2 steaming mugs, watching her stretch the yellow tape across the bay window where my grandmother's lace curtains had hung for the past 6 months. The same curtains I'd carefully cleaned and pressed when Mark and I first moved into the house I'd inherited. "What curtains?" I asked, setting her mug down on the coffee table. "Oh, just some ideas I've been having," she said, winding up the measuring tape with practiced efficiency. "These old things are so dated, don't you think? They make the whole room feel like a museum." The words stung more than they should have. Those curtains had been my grandmother's pride, hand-sewn Irish lace that had taken her 3 months to complete. They weren't dated, they were timeless. But Nadia was already moving on to the next window, her notebook out, scribbling down numbers. "I didn't realize you were redecorating," I said carefully. "Not redecorating?" She laughed, settling into my favorite armchair without being invited. "Just optimizing. You have such good bones in this house, Tessa, but you're not using them to their full potential." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for her unsolicited analysis of my home's shortcomings. I sat down on the sofa, wrapping my hands around my mug for warmth. "I'm actually really happy with how things look." "Of course you are," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "But sometimes we get so comfortable with our surroundings that we stop seeing possibilities. That's where fresh eyes come in handy." Fresh eyes. As if my eyes, the ones that had lovingly chosen every piece of furniture, every photograph, every small detail that made this house feel like home, were somehow stale or inadequate. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, not casual snapshots, but deliberate, methodical shots from multiple angles. She photographed my bookshelves, my kitchen counter, even the small collection of ceramic birds my grandmother had left me. "What are those for?" I asked, watching her crouch down to get a better angle of my coffee table. "Just documenting the current state," she said, snapping another photo. "It's always good to have a baseline before making changes." "Before making changes, not if." The assumption in her voice made my stomach tighten. I hadn't asked for changes. I hadn't even hinted that I was dissatisfied with anything. But somehow, in the 15 minutes since she'd arrived, my home had become a project. Her project. "You know," she said, standing up and brushing imaginary dust off her designer jeans, "I've been thinking about hosting a little family gathering here next month. Nothing fancy, just the immediate family, but we'd want the place to look its best, you know. We'd want, not I'd want. We'd want." "I wasn't planning on hosting anything," I said. "Oh, but you should," she insisted, walking over to examine my dining room table. "This house is perfect for entertaining. Mark mentioned you inherited it from your grandmother, right? She must have loved having people over." She ran her fingers along the table surface, then opened the hutch where I kept my grandmother's china. Without asking, she pulled out a dinner plate and examined it in the light. "These are lovely," she said, though her tone suggested they were anything but. "Very traditional. We might want to supplement them with something more contemporary for the party." "What party?" I asked, following her into the dining room. "The one we should definitely have," she said, setting the plate back down with a small clink. "It would be such a shame to waste this space, and honestly, Tessa, you could use more practice with entertaining. It's an important skill for a wife to develop." An important skill for a wife to develop. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, as if my worth as Mark's wife could be measured by my ability to throw dinner parties that met her standards. "I'm not much of a party person," I said. "That's exactly why you need practice," she replied, moving back toward the living room. Don't worry, I'll help you plan everything. Menu, decorations, seating arrangements, the whole thing. It'll be fun. She said it like it was already decided, like my preferences and comfort level were minor obstacles to be overcome rather than valid considerations to be respected. I watched her circle my living room again, this time making notes about furniture placement. She moved a lamp 3 inches to the left, adjusted the angle of a picture frame, and relocated a small vase from the mantel to the side table. There, she said, stepping back to admire her work. See how much better that flows? I looked at the changes she'd made. They were small, almost imperceptible, but they fundamentally altered the room's character. The lamp now cast harsh shadows where there had been soft, warm light. The picture frame, tilted at what she probably considered a more dynamic angle, now looked crooked and unstable. The vase, moved from its place of honor above the fireplace, seemed lost and forgotten on the side table. It looked fine before, I said. Fine isn't the same as optimal, she replied, pulling out her phone to take an after photo. You'll get used to it. Change is always uncomfortable at first. She stayed for another hour, moving through my house with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She rearranged my spice rack, reorganized my bathroom vanity, and even suggested I replace my bedroom curtains with something more romantic. When Mark came home from work, he found us in the kitchen where Nadia was explaining her vision for updating my backsplash. Hey babe, he said, kissing my cheek. I see my sister's been keeping you busy. Just sharing some ideas, Nadia said brightly. Tessa has been so receptive to suggestions. Receptive, as if I'd been eagerly soliciting her advice instead of politely enduring her unsolicited criticism. That's nice of you to help, Mark said, but I caught the slight confusion in his voice. He looked around the kitchen, taking in the small changes she'd made throughout the day. It's what family does, Nadia said, gathering her things. We help each other become the best versions of ourselves. After she left, Mark and I stood in our rearranged living room surveying the subtle but significant changes she'd made to our space. She means well, he said finally. I know, I replied, though something deep in my chest disagreed. That night, I quietly moved everything back to where it belonged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something that went beyond furniture placement and decorating suggestions. Nadia hadn't just rearranged my house. She'd rearranged the dynamic between us, and somehow, without my realizing it, I'd become the student in need of her instruction, in my own home. 3 days later, Nadia returned with what she called housewarming gifts. Though Mark and I had been living here for 8 months already, she swept through the front door carrying shopping bags from expensive home stores, her face bright with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation, she said, unpacking items onto my dining room table without invitation. So, I picked up a few things that'll really make this place pop. The first item she pulled out was a throw pillow electric orange with geometric patterns that seemed to vibrate against the neutral palette I'd carefully chosen for the living room. Before I could say anything, she'd marched over to my grandmother's burgundy velvet sofa and placed it dead center against the carefully arranged cream and sage pillows I'd selected. See, she said, stepping back with her hands on her hips. Instant energy boost. The pillow looked like a traffic cone that had gotten lost at a furniture store. It clashed so violently with everything else in the room that I actually felt my eye twitch looking at it. It's very bright, I managed. Exactly, she exclaimed, pulling out more items. This whole place needs more personality. You play it so safe, Tessa. Next came a wall clock shaped like a sunburst, all sharp gold rays and modern angles. She hung it on the wall where my grandmother's watercolor landscape had been, moving the painting to what she called a less prominent spot behind the bookshelf. Time is the most important element in any room, she announced, adjusting the clock's position. And this one makes a statement. The statement it made was that someone with questionable taste had invaded my living room, but I kept that observation to myself. She continued unpacking. A metallic vase that looked like it belonged in a space station. Coasters with abstract designs that hurt to look at, and a table runner made from some kind of shimmery fabric that seemed to change colors depending on the light. These will really tie everything together, she said, arranging them with the precision of someone decorating for a magazine shoot rather than a home where people actually lived. I watched her transform my space into something unrecognizable, each new addition feeling like a small act of aggression against everything I'd worked to create. But when I opened my mouth to protest, she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Trust the process, Tessa. I know it feels overwhelming now, but you'll thank me once you see the finished result." Finished result? As if my home had been unfinished before her intervention. The following Saturday, I returned from my morning yoga class to find cars in my driveway and the smell of garlic and herbs wafting from my kitchen windows. I walked through my front door to discover Nadia wearing one of my aprons, stirring something on my stove while Mark's parents and his younger brother sat around my dining table. "Oh, good. You're back," she called out cheerfully as if I'd been expected to participate in whatever this was. "I'm making my famous lasagna for everyone. Mark mentioned you wouldn't mind if I used your kitchen." I looked at Mark, who was setting out napkins with the guilty expression of someone who'd forgotten to mention something important. "I thought you knew," he said weakly. "Knew what?" I asked. "That we were having a family lunch today," his mother, Patricia, said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nadia organized the whole thing. Such a thoughtful girl." I stood in my own foyer, feeling like an intruder at my own family gathering. Everyone was seated comfortably, drinks poured, bread already on the table. The only empty chair was the one at the far end, the spot usually reserved for guests rather than the host. "Don't worry about helping," Nadia said, adding what looked like enough oregano to season a small restaurant's worth of food. "I've got everything under control. You just relax. Relax in my own home while someone else played hostess at my table." During lunch, the conversation turned to work, and Nadia saw her opening. "Tessa's been so busy with her little art projects," she said, passing the salad with a smile that managed to be both sweet and condescending. "It's wonderful that she has creative hobbies to keep her occupied." "They're not hobbies," I said quietly. "I'm a freelance graphic designer. I have clients." "Of course, dear," Patricia said in the tone people use when humoring children. "It's important to have interests outside the home, though it's not like she brings in a real income." Nadia added with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes made of knives. "Not like Mark, obviously, but it keeps her busy, and that's what matters." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. I felt my face flush, but when I looked at Mark for support, he was focused intently on his lasagna, as if the secrets of the universe could be found in Nadia's ricotta layer. "Actually," I started, but Nadia was already moving on to ask his brother about his new promotion, effectively ending my chance to defend myself. After they left, I found myself walking through my house like a visitor in a museum, trying to remember what it had felt like when it was mine. The orange pillow seemed to mock me from the sofa. The sunburst clock ticked loudly, counting down moments in a space that no longer felt like home. Over the following weeks, I started noticing other changes, small things at first. My grandmother's silver picture frame replaced with a modern black one, my favorite ceramic bowl switched out for something angular and white. When I asked about the missing items, Nadia explained that she was curating a more cohesive aesthetic. "Your grandmother had lovely things," she said, "but they were fighting with the overall energy of the space. I put them somewhere safe where they won't clash with the new direction we're going." We, as if this were a collaborative effort, rather than a slow-motion invasion. The breaking point came 3 weeks later when I returned from a business trip to Chicago. I'd been gone for 4 days working with a new client who was paying me more than Nadia probably made in 2 months. I was tired but satisfied, keys in hand as I approached my front door. The key didn't turn. I tried again, thinking maybe the lock was sticking. Nothing. I checked to make sure I was using the right key, even though I'd used it hundreds of times before. Still nothing. Confused and slightly panicked, I rang my own doorbell. Nadia answered, wearing an apron I didn't recognize and looking surprised to see me. "Oh, Tessa," she said, as if my presence at my own front door was unexpected. "Mark forgot to tell you about the security upgrade. We had new locks installed while you were away. Much safer than those old ones. You know how important home security is these days." She handed me a new key with the casual air of someone distributing party favors, but the gesture felt like something else entirely. It felt like being given permission to enter my own life. "Mark didn't mention anything about changing the locks," I said, testing the new key in the unfamiliar hardware. "Men never remember the details," she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Lucky for him, he has family looking out for his best interests." I stepped into my house with its new locks and borrowed key, and realized that, somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the owner and become the tenant. and the worst part was I wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. That Sunday started like any other family dinner, except I'd reached my limit with the kitchen drawer reorganization project that had been happening weekly for the past month. I walked into my kitchen to find Nadia elbow-deep in what used to be my perfectly organized utensil drawer, redistributing everything according to what she called proper kitchen function. My grandmother's wooden spoons were being relocated to make room for a set of silicone spatulas she brought over, claiming they were more hygienic and modern. "Nadia," I said, keeping my voice level, "please don't rearrange that drawer again. I need to be able to find things in my own kitchen." She looked up from her reorganization project with genuine surprise, as if I'd just asked her to stop breathing. "But Tessa, honey, this makes so much more sense. Look, all the serving utensils together, measuring tools in their own section, it's basic kitchen organization." "It was already organized," I said, watching her move my grandmother's silver cake server to what she deemed a less prominent position. The way I had it organized, the way I could find everything. Mark's parents were setting the table in the dining room, well within earshot of our conversation. His brother and sister-in-law had arrived 10 minutes earlier and were making drinks, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen, where our voices were getting slightly sharper. "Sometimes we can't see our own blind spots," Nadia said, continuing to rearrange despite my clear request to stop. "That's what family is for, to help us improve." The word improve hit me wrong. Everything in my life had apparently needed improvement since she'd started her campaign to transform my house. My furniture needed improvement, my decorating needed improvement, my hosting skills needed improvement, and now my basic ability to organize a kitchen drawer needed improvement. "I'm asking you to stop," I said more firmly. She paused, a bundle of measuring spoons in her hand, and looked at me with the kind of patient expression teachers use with difficult children. "Tessa, I'm trying to help you. There's no need to get defensive about constructive feedback." "It's not feedback when you physically rearrange my belongings without permission," I said, moving to put the measuring spoons back where they belonged. "It's just rearranging my belongings without permission." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the drawer sliding shut. From the dining room, I could hear conversations quieting as everyone tuned in to what was happening in my kitchen. Nadia straightened up, and I watched something shift in her expression. The helpful, sisterly mask slipped just enough for me to see what was underneath something harder, more calculating. "You know what, Tessa?" she said, her voice carrying clearly into the dining room. "I think I understand the real problem here." She walked closer to me, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume and see the small lines around her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide. "The problem isn't that I'm trying to help. The problem is that you can't handle someone else having opinions about this house because you're so insecure about your place in it." I felt my breath catch. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Her voice was getting louder, more confident, like she'd been building up to this moment for weeks. "You act like you own this place, but let's be honest about what's really happening here." The dining room had gone completely quiet. I could practically feel Mark's family leaning in to hear better. "You're just living off my brother's money," she said, loud enough that there was no doubt everyone had heard her clearly. "You don't contribute anything real to this household. You play around with your little art projects while Mark pays for everything. The mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, everything." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt my face get hot, but not with embarrassment. It was something else entirely. Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale. "Nadia, what are you doing?" "I'm saying what everyone's thinking," she replied, crossing her arms. "Tessa acts like she's the lady of the manor, but she's basically a kept woman. No real job, no real income, no real claim to any of this." Patricia and Jim had materialized behind Mark, their faces showing a mixture of shock and fascination. Mark's brother was pretending to examine the wine bottle label while obviously listening to every word. I looked at Nadia, really looked at her, and felt something click into place. All those weeks of small invasions, subtle undermining, and gradual territory claiming suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been helping or improving anything. She'd been positioning herself to have this exact conversation. "Is that so?" I said quietly, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Something in my tone must have registered, because Nadia's confident expression flickered slightly. But she'd committed to her path now, and she wasn't backing down. "Yes, that's so," she said. "And frankly, I think it's time someone called you out on it. You waltz around here making decisions about a house you have no real claim to, acting like you're some kind of equal partner when everyone knows Mark is carrying you financially. Nadia, stop, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked confused, caught between defending his wife and dealing with his sister's public accusation. No, I won't stop, she continued. Someone needs to say it. Tessa, you're living in a house you didn't pay for, eating food you didn't buy, making rules about property that isn't yours. And when someone tries to help you improve the situation, you get territorial and defensive. She gestured around the kitchen as if presenting evidence to a jury. This isn't your house, Tessa. It's Mark's house that you happen to live in. There's a difference. My heart was pounding, but not from fear or embarrassment, from something that felt almost like relief. Because after weeks of subtle attacks and passive-aggressive undermining, Nadia had finally shown her hand. She'd finally said out loud what she'd been implying all along, and now I could respond. You're absolutely right, I said, watching her face light up with premature victory. There is a difference between living in someone else's house and owning your own. I walked over to the kitchen drawer where I kept important documents, the same drawer she'd been reorganizing moments earlier. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the counter. There's also a difference, I continued, opening the folder, between making assumptions about someone's financial situation and actually knowing the facts. Nadia's expression was starting to change as I pulled out the document I'd been waiting months to show her. And the fact is, I said, holding up the deed to the house, this isn't Mark's house that I happen to live in. I set the deed on the counter where everyone could see it clearly. My name was printed in official black ink, with all the proper stamps and legal language that made ownership official and indisputable. This is my house that Mark happens to live in, I said. I inherited it from my grandmother. I own it completely, and that means when someone comes into my kitchen and tells me I have no real claim to my own property, I looked directly at Nadia, who had gone completely silent for the first time since I'd met her. Well, I said with a smile I'd been saving for exactly this moment, I get to tell them exactly how wrong they are. For exactly 3 seconds after I showed the deed, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming and the clock ticking in the hallway. Nadia stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language, her mouth slightly open, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to rage. That's impossible, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The county courthouse would disagree, I replied, keeping my tone conversational. Everything's properly filed and recorded, has been since my grandmother passed away 2 years ago. Mark stepped closer to look at the deed, his eyes scanning the official language and legal stamps. I watched his face as the reality sank in that his wife owned the house he'd been living in, that his sister had been systematically undermining the actual property owner, that he'd been complicit in letting it happen. Tessa, he said slowly, why didn't you ever tell me you owned the house? You never asked, I said simply. When we decided to move in together, you assumed it was yours because it had been in my family. I corrected you once early on, but you seemed to forget. After a while, it felt easier to just let it be. Patricia was examining the deed over Mark's shoulder, her face pale as she read my name clearly printed as the sole owner. Jim stood behind her, looking like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. But Nadia wasn't looking at the deed anymore. She was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure, undiluted fury, mixed with something that might have been humiliation. You let me believe. She started, then stopped, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, I said. You never asked me about the ownership. You never asked me about my finances. You just made assumptions and ran with them. This is fraud, she said, her voice getting shrill. You deliberately deceived us. You let us think Mark owned this place while you were plotting to what? I asked, genuinely curious where she was going with this. To live in my own house, to make decisions about my own property, to have opinions about how my own kitchen should be organized. Mark's brother cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe we should all just calm down and... Nadia whirled on him, her voice rising to a level that made everyone in the room take a step back. She's been lying to all of us for months, making us look like fools. I haven't lied about anything, I said, my own voice getting firmer. I've been living in my house, making decisions about my property and trying to be polite while you systematically tried to take over both. You manipulative little... She started, but Mark cut her off. "Nadia, enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority I rarely heard from him. "Tess is right. She never lied. We assumed things that weren't true." Nadia laughed, but there was nothing funny about the sound. "Don't you dare take her side on this, Mark. She made fools of all of us. She sat there while I tried to help improve this place, never once mentioning that she owned it." "Help improve it," I said, feeling my own temper starting to rise. "Is that what you call replacing my belongings with your decorations? Hosting dinners in my dining room without asking? Changing my locks?" "You changed the locks?" Mark asked, looking at his sister with genuine shock. "For security," Nadia said defensively, but her voice was losing some of its conviction. "The old ones were practically antiques. Anyone could have broken in." "Anyone except me, apparently," I said, since I had to ring my own doorbell to get into my own house. Patricia was shaking her head slowly, pieces apparently falling into place for her as well. "Nadia, honey, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking that someone needed to help Mark's wife learn how to properly maintain a household," Nadia shot back. "I was thinking that maybe if she put some effort into making a nice home, Mark would be happier." "Mark was already happy," I said quietly. "The only person who wasn't happy with how things were was you." That's when something in her expression snapped completely. The careful control she'd maintained, even while shouting, disappeared entirely. Her face flushed red, and she looked around the kitchen like she was searching for something. Her eyes landed on the crystal vase she'd brought over weeks ago, one of her improvements that had been sitting on my sideboard ever since. Without warning, she lunged for it, grabbed it with both hands, and hurled it across the room with a sound that was part scream, part sob. The vase flew past my head and crashed into the living room wall with an explosion of crystal and sound that seemed to echo forever. Pieces scattered across the hardwood floor, some sliding under furniture, others spinning to a stop near the fireplace. Right next to where it hit the wall was my grandmother's wedding photo, the one in the antique silver frame that had somehow survived Nadia's redecorating efforts. The impact had knocked it askew, and I could see a spiderweb crack spreading across the glass, covering my grandmother's smiling face. "You ruined everything!" Nadia screamed, her voice breaking with the force of it. "Everything I tried to do, everything I tried to build here, you ruined it all with your stupid deed and your stupid lies." Mark was staring at his sister like he'd never seen her before. "Nadia, what is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" She laughed wildly, gesturing at the broken crystals scattered across my floor. "What's wrong with me is that I've been trying to help my family while she's been playing games with all of us." Jim had his phone out and was dialing. I could hear him speaking quietly to someone, giving our address, mentioning property damage and a domestic disturbance. "You called the police?" Nadia asked incredulously. "You just threw a vase at my daughter-in-law in her own home," Patricia said firmly. "Yes, he called the police." The word daughter-in-law seemed to hit Nadia like a physical blow. She looked around the room at all of us, her family looking at her with expressions ranging from shock to disappointment to something that might have been fear. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice was smaller now, deflated. "You think you're so smart with your little deed, but this isn't over. Actually," I said, bending down to pick up a large piece of crystal that had landed near my feet. "I think it is." When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found Nadia sitting on my front steps, no longer screaming but muttering to herself about betrayal and manipulation. They found me in my living room carefully collecting pieces of broken crystal, while Mark held a dustpan and apologized over and over again. They found a deed with my name on it, a damaged photograph of my grandmother, and a family that was finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in months. And they found a woman who owned her own house, sitting in her own living room, finally ready to defend what had always been hers. The officers left around 9 o'clock that evening, taking their incident report and leaving behind a house that felt different, somehow quieter, but also more settled. Mark's parents had gone home immediately after giving their statements. Patricia hugged me tightly before she left and whispered, "I'm so sorry, honey," into my ear. Jim had shaken Mark's hand and told him to call if we needed anything, his usual gruff demeanor softened by what we'd all witnessed. Mark and I stood in the living room, surrounded by tiny pieces of crystal that caught the lamplight like scattered stars. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with things that needed to be said. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, crouching down to help me collect the remaining shards. And I need you to be completely honest with me. I waited, holding a dustpan steady while he swept crystal into it with careful, precise movements. How long have you been angry with me? He asked, not looking up from his task. The question surprised me. I'd expected him to ask about the house, about my inheritance, about why I'd never insisted he understand the ownership situation, but this was deeper, more personal. I wasn't angry with you, I said slowly, thinking about it. I was disappointed. There's a difference. He sat back on his heels, finally meeting my eyes. What's the difference? Angry would have been if you'd actively participated in what Nadia was doing. Disappointed was watching you choose to look the other way while she did it. He nodded, absorbing this. That's fair. That's more than fair, actually. We worked in silence for a few more minutes, collecting the last pieces of Nadia's final tantrum. When the floor was clean, Mark sat down heavily on the sofa, running his hands through his hair. I need to call them, he said. My parents, my brother. I need to tell them the truth about what's been happening here. You don't have to do that tonight, I said, sitting down beside him. Yes, I do, he said firmly, because if I wait until tomorrow, I'll find reasons to put it off. And this needs to be said while I still have the courage to say it. He made the calls right there in the living room while I listened. First his parents, then his brother, then 2 aunts and his cousin who'd all heard Nadia's version of events over the past few months. Each conversation was essentially the same, Mark explaining that the house was mine, that Nadia had been out of line, and that he should have stopped it months ago. No, Mom. Tessa didn't trick anyone, I heard him say during the longest call. We just never asked the right questions, and she was too polite to correct our assumptions. Yes, I know Nadia was trying to help, but helping doesn't include changing someone's locks without permission. No, this isn't about taking sides. This is about respecting the person who actually lives here. When he finished the last call, he looked exhausted but lighter somehow. How do you feel? I asked. Like I should have done that 6 months ago, he said. Like I've been a terrible husband and an even worse partner. You haven't been terrible, I said. You've been conflict avoidant, which isn't the same thing, but it's not sustainable either. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Sarah Martinez had handled my grandmother's estate, and she'd been the one to walk me through the inheritance process when my grandmother passed. She listened patiently while I explained the situation with Nadia, the assumption issues with Mark's family, and my desire to protect the property from any future challenges. What you want is a revocable living trust, she said. It'll protect the house and make your ownership absolutely clear to anyone who might have questions in the future. Plus, it'll make things easier for Mark if anything ever happens to you. 2 weeks later, I had a folder full of legal documents that made my ownership of the house ironclad and indisputable. I made copies, lots of copies, and stored them in multiple locations. The original deed went into a safety deposit box. A copy went into our home safe. Another copy went to Sarah's office. I even gave one to my sister, asking her to keep it somewhere secure. You're being very thorough, Mark observed, watching me organize the documents. I'm being smart, I replied. I let assumptions slide once. I'm not letting it happen again. That weekend, I started what I privately called the Great Restoration. I went through every room systematically, removing Nadia's additions and returning my own things to their rightful places. The orange pillow went into a donation bag. The sunburst clock went back to whatever trendy store it had come from. I actually returned it and got store credit. The metallic vase found its way to a neighbor who admired modern pieces. I brought my grandmother's lamp back out from the closet where Nadia had banished it. I rehung the family photographs she deemed too traditional. I painted the kitchen a warm sage green that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been slowly erased. Mark helped with everything, approaching each task with the focus of someone trying to make amends. He painted trim, hung pictures, and moved furniture without offering a single opinion about placement or color choices. When I asked what he thought about the green kitchen, he said, I think it's your kitchen, and I'm happy you're making it feel like home again. 3 weeks after the crystal vase incident, I decided to host Sunday dinner again. But this time, the guest list was entirely different. I invited my sister Rachel and her 2 kids, my college roommate who lived nearby, and an elderly neighbor who'd become a friend over the past year. No one questioned my menu choices. No one rearranged my place settings. No one suggested improvements to my hosting style. We ate chicken pot pie and laughed about Rachel's 8-year-old son's attempt to train their cat to fetch. My friend shared stories from her recent trip to Ireland. The neighbor brought homemade rolls and complimented my grandmother's china, asking about the history behind the delicate rose pattern. It was the first dinner party I'd hosted in my own house, where I felt like the host instead of the help. After everyone left, Mark and I cleaned up together in comfortable silence. As I was drying the last plate, he said quietly, "This is what it should have been like all along, isn't it?" "Yes," I said simply. "This is what home feels like." The next morning, I found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words written in Nadia's distinctive handwriting. "You'll regret this, Tessa." I read it twice, then walked calmly to the kitchen where my shredder lived in the pantry. I fed the letter into the machine and watched it disappear into tiny, harmless strips of paper. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, looking up from his coffee. "Everything's perfect," I said, and meant it completely. 6 months after the shredded letter incident, I was watering my grandmother's rose bushes when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see Patricia getting out of her sedan, carrying what looked like a covered casserole dish and wearing the slightly nervous expression she developed whenever she visited now. "Morning," she called out as she approached. "I made too much lasagna last night, and I thought you and Mark might enjoy some." It was the 4th time in 2 months she'd brought over extra food, and we both knew it wasn't really about leftovers. These visits were her way of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by months of assumptions and misunderstandings. "I never mind," I said, setting down my watering can and brushing soil off my gardening gloves. "Mark's inside if you want to say hello." "Actually," she said, setting the dish down on the porch table, "I was hoping to talk to you first if you have a minute." I gestured to the porch chairs and we sat down together in the late afternoon sunshine. Patricia was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden that I'd been slowly expanding over the past year. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "A real one, not just the quick sorry I gave you that night when everything fell apart." "Patricia, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently, "because I realized something about myself that I don't like very much. I was so focused on keeping peace in the family that I didn't pay attention to who was actually causing the problems." She turned to look at me directly. "Nadia is my daughter, and I love her, but loving someone doesn't mean pretending they're not capable of being wrong, and she was very, very wrong about how she treated you." "She was struggling with some things," I said diplomatically. "She was jealous," Patricia said bluntly. "Jealous that you had what she wanted, a beautiful home, a devoted husband, a peaceful life. Instead of dealing with those feelings in a healthy way, she decided to tear down what you'd built." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder I'd recently installed near the rose bushes. "Can I ask you something?" Patricia said. "Why didn't you ever correct us when we assumed Mark owned the house?" It was a question I'd been asked several times over the past year, and I'd developed a clearer answer through thinking about it. "Because it didn't seem to matter," I said. "Mark and I were building a life together. Whether the house was legally mine or his didn't change how we lived in it or how we made decisions about it. At least it didn't until someone made it matter." "Nadia made it matter," Patricia said quietly. "Nadia made ownership into a weapon." I agreed. And once it became a weapon, I had to defend myself with the truth. That evening, Mark and I were having dinner on the back patio, another addition I'd made during the restoration process. We'd installed string lights and planted herbs in containers, creating a space that felt both private and welcoming. "My mom seemed different today," Mark said, cutting into the lasagna Patricia had left. "More, I don't know, more like herself, maybe." "She's processing everything that happened," I said. "It takes time to readjust when you realize someone you trusted was manipulating situations." "Do you think Nadia was consciously manipulating things?" he asked. "Or do you think she genuinely believed she was helping?" It was a question I'd considered many times. "I think it started as helping and became manipulation when helping didn't get her what she wanted," I said. "The scary part is I don't think she could tell the difference by the end." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't inherited this house?" Mark asked. "If we'd been renting somewhere, or if I'd been the one with family property." "You mean, would Nadia have found other ways to undermine me?" I considered this. Probably. The house was just a convenient target. If it hadn't been the house, it would have been my career or my cooking or how I folded laundry. People who need to diminish others will always find something to focus on. "That's depressing," he said. It's realistic, I replied, but it's also empowering because once you understand the pattern, you can choose not to participate in it. 3 weeks later, I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a delivery truck in the driveway. The driver handed me a large envelope that required a signature. Inside was a legal document from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was a formal demand letter claiming that I had unlawfully excluded a family member from joint family property and demanding that I cease and desist from preventing reasonable family access to the shared residence. I read it twice, then called Sarah Martinez. "This is interesting," she said after I'd read her the letter over the phone. "Legally, it's complete nonsense. You can't be unlawfully excluded from property you don't own. And there's no such thing as automatic family access to someone else's private residence. But it tells us that Nadia hasn't given up. What should I do about it?" "Let me handle it," Sarah said. "I'll send a response that makes it very clear that any further harassment will result in a restraining order. Sometimes people need official legal language to understand that their behavior needs to stop." That evening, I showed the letter to Mark. He read it with increasing disbelief, shaking his head by the time he reached the end. "She hired a lawyer to try to force her way back into our house," he said. "She hired a lawyer to try to intimidate me into letting her back into my house," I corrected. "There's a difference. Are you worried about this?" I thought about it honestly. A year ago, receiving legal threats would have terrified me. But now, sitting in my own living room surrounded by my grandmother's furniture and my own choices, I felt remarkably calm. "No," I said. "I'm not worried because I know exactly who I am, what I own, and what I'm willing to accept, and I have the documentation to prove all of it." 2 days later, Sarah called to tell me that Nadia's lawyer had withdrawn the demand letter after receiving Sarah's response. Apparently, when faced with actual legal consequences for filing frivolous demands, both the lawyer and his client had decided to pursue other options. "What other options?" I asked. "Hopefully moving on with her life," Sarah said. "But if not, we're prepared for whatever comes next." That weekend, Mark and I were working in the garden together. He was building raised beds while I transplanted seedlings when he stopped and looked at the house with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "I'm thinking about how different this place feels now," he said. "Not just because of the changes we've made, but because of how we are in it. How are we different?" "You're not apologizing for taking up space anymore," he said. "And I'm not pretending that avoiding conflict is the same thing as solving problems." He was right. I moved through the house now with the confidence of someone who belonged there completely. I made decisions about furniture, decorations, and renovations without seeking permission or validation. I invited people over when I wanted company and said no when I didn't. I'd learned the difference between being polite and being a pushover. "You know what I realized?" I said, patting soil around a tomato plant. "I spent so much energy trying to keep everyone happy that I forgot to make sure I was happy. But happiness isn't something you can give away to keep peace. It's something you have to claim for yourself." "And have you?" he asked. "Claimed it for yourself?" I looked around at the garden we were building together, at the house that bore my name on its deed and my choices in its rooms, at the man who'd learned to listen and stand up for what mattered. "Yes," I said, and meant it with every part of myself. "I absolutely have." That night, as we sat on the back patio sharing a bottle of wine under the string lights, I thought about Nadia's voice in my head, the one that had whispered doubts about my worth, my contributions, my right to take up space in my own life. The voice was still there sometimes, but it was quieter now. And when it spoke, I had a response ready, a house with my name on the deed, a marriage built on honesty instead of assumptions, and the hard-earned knowledge that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be true.